Hey everybody, this is Brian here, and we're going to be talking the top 10 underrated wrestlers of all time, men and women. We're going to be mainly focusing on people who didn't get the shot to be the guys, so to speak. They had great careers, primarily focusing mainly on people whose careers are over. That way, there's nothing still left to develop, so to speak, that could change our judgments. So I'm mostly focusing on people whose script is written, so to speak. Um, I guess this would be people who, like I said, really, uh, never really flowered fully, never got their full chance, or at least they haven't been recognized or remembered for it. People who aren't often thought of in the same tier of the Eddie Guerreros or of the Bret Harts or Shawn Michaels. Someone like Ultimo Dragon, for example, who is a fantastic wrestler in the ring, but he isn't exactly remembered in that tier of like the greatest guys of all time. At least not by most people. At least not in America. Maybe they think of him differently in Japan. He probably has a higher reputation there than the kind of stupid Power Ranger attire gimmick that they gave him to go out there and do a bunch of flippy moves without talking. Um, you know, and that's kind of what it equated to. It's probably what held him back was that it limited his character. But anyways, that's kind of what we're using to define honor or to define underrated here is people who never really flowered fully because they weren't really given the chance. Not to say that these people did nothing or that they weren't talented or skilled, just that for some reason they aren't exactly thought of in the top guys of their generation and the top guys of all time. Either they're left out of the Hall of Fame or they're just kind of not spoken of in that same breath. So let's get to it. Honorable mentions go to Just Incredible from ECW primarily. Um, I think that towards the end he helped carry that ship as it came to the docks, towards their final days. In the same way that Bret Hart helped to shepherd the WWF through a weak period in the early 90s, I think that Just Incredible was part of the guys who were around after many, many people had left by that point in the early 2000s, many people had left, and ECW was kind of left with their B sides, so to speak. They were left with their people who weren't really, they weren't people on the level of like, uh, hmm, I you know, I'm trying to think of an exact name, but what comes to mind for me is Mike Awesome defecting with the belt and then getting a bunch of stupid ass gimmicks that were humiliating. Anyways, but Just Incredible was one of the guys who was there. Um, and I think that he was one of the guys who put on great shows along with guys like Steve Corino. And Just Incredible is, I think, underrated as a latter day ECW champion. It might not have been classic ECW, people going through flaming tables and doing leg drops over the guardrail and stuff, but uh, I think the fact that he had the cane was a little bit overtly stolen from Sandman, but um, yeah, I don't know. Just Incredible to me is underrated, worth an honorable mention at least. Maybe not being on the list, might be a little bit of a number 11 or 12 in the top 10. Someone else, a proverbial underrated person, a proverbial other guy, so to speak, overshadowed but not necessarily not talented by any means. Marty Jannetty, overshadowed by Shawn Michaels, kind of, I don't think ever really got the chance to become the full performer on the level of someone like HBK or Mr. Perfect or something, Ted DiBiase, on the level of someone great like that, the Hitman, you never really got to see Marty Jannetty flower to that level because he was always overshadowed. He was always thought of as like the B guy in that tag team. Another person who is far more talented in the ring than the gimmick they were given is Al Snow. He's another honorable mention. Al Snow. He was given that stupid gimmick of being a crazy person with a mannequin head, and he had like "Help Me" written on his forehead backwards or something. I think that Al Snow is a lot more talented than that kind of mentally unstable character he played in the late 1990s in the Attitude Era. I guess it worked for him. It was the character he ultimately got in No Mercy. That was how they cast him. But I just think he looked stupid. I think it was degrading. It was offensive towards anyone with any sort of mental illness or neurological thing. I think that Al Snow was a better wrestler in the ring and a better wrestler on the mic in terms of he was able to get that stupid gimmick over. Think about that for a second. Think of the talent that takes. I think Al deserves more credit. He's worth an honorable mention. Someone I mentioned in a negative light as a defector is our next honorable mention at our final one, which is Mike Awesome. Somebody who didn't wrestle that long stateside before they went to WCW, but his reign in ECW as champion is memorable, as are his matches. Extremely stiff matches against Masato Tanaka. Um, Mike Awesome was one of the most talented big men in the ring that I ever saw. I think he probably did more in Japan than he did stateside, which is why he's so underrated. But Mike Awesome unfortunately committed suicide, I think, in 2007. Hung himself. Um, I guess his personal life and after his career kind of went to shit like that after he left. He wasn't considered reliable, and it's almost like he had his retribution match at One Night Stand versus Tanaka, and he walked out, and they were chanting for him when Joey Styles had at the beginning called him like a Judas and everything. I think Mike Awesome was somebody who didn't have that much of a time in the sun in a stateside. I think he probably did more in Japan than he did here, which is why he's only an honorable mention, unfortunately. Let's get to the actual list now, though. Number one on here. This is under rated people, like I said before. On unranked is what I was trying to say. This is number one on here. It's going to be William Regal. I enjoyed his work as like the SmackDown like heel general manager and stuff, and his time ringside as a manager. Not that I didn't like his work in the ring. I thought the brass knuckles thing worked well for him. Um, I think it worked better than that outdated British king thing. He has to be royal and speak with big words because he's English. He's English, therefore he has to be pretentious and smart and witty. It's like because we're WWE and we work off stereotypes. That's the message we want to send to our kids. Anyways, though, I think that Regal was always underrated, and think back to that classic match where he was weirdly enough paired with Dave Taylor, and I think his only like notable WWE appearance. William Regal was always underrated in the ring. He was a great technical wrestler. He was willing to take bumps. He was genuinely stiff, but at the same time, he was also willing to take it too. He was somebody who really wasn't given his dues for having a fantastic, long, and very accomplished career as a respected performer. But for some reason, he's kind of, like I said, trapped in that B tier of guys who are, for some reason, not thought of along the same lines as Mitsuharu Misawa or Chris Benoit or Bret Hart or something, Shawn Michaels. Along those lines of like the greatest wrestler of all time, you don't for some reason think of a guy like Regal. Even though in the ring and on the mic, he was really one of the best. He was able to get himself over as a heel when the fans previously hadn't cared about it much in his time since WCW. I mean, over in America before his time in WWE, I don't think he was ever really that over. But he managed to kind of get out of nowhere or come out of nowhere and get over with the fans based on the fact that he was naturally charismatic and he was in tune with them in the sense that he was a good heel. And also, again, I like the brass knuckles thing. I liked his time as a manager. I think William Regal deserves more credit than he gets. I don't know if I'd put him in the Hall of Fame quite, but he's one of those guys who definitely deserves to be in the discussion, if not in. Um, Another person who's on here is going to be Shane Douglas. Now, before I completely say Shane Douglas is underrated, he did have multiple reigns as the ECW heavyweight champion. So I'm not saying that Shane Douglas was completely unrecognized. That's not at all what I mean. He had a great career. But for some reason, when Shane Douglas was in one of the bigger companies, he was always given a stupid gimmick. It always seemed like he was treated like a joke, like a B guy. And it never seems like Shane Douglas got the chance to be. I mean, he was fantastic on the mic. Watch that belt dropping promo where he announces the sport of professional wrestling, and try not to fucking cry if you're a hardcore wrestling fan. That was one of the best promos ever cut in all of wrestling history, even though it tarnished the belt a bit. Um, Shane Douglas was fantastic in the ring too, an above average amateur and professional wrestler in terms of selling, in terms of ring psychology, in terms of getting over with the fans. Um, his stables worked, but he was always given stupid gimmicks and treated like a B guy. I don't understand that. Why he was treated like someone who they thought couldn't get over and wouldn't sell with the fans, in terms of, or I guess I should say the fans wouldn't buy him as a main event star, so to speak. They wouldn't buy tickets to that. They wouldn't buy the merchandise, so on. I don't know, but I think Shane Douglas, despite his recognition on the independent circuit and in the ECW, is one of those guys who, for some reason, was never thought of as a Hall of Fame main event caliber, one of the greatest talkers and in-ring performers of all time. He was both. For some reason, Shane Douglas isn't often mentioned, rather, in that same breath, though I think he should be. Another person here at number 3 who is very, very, very highly respected, but not often mentioned because of some of his acrimonious personal choices and his injury, is Tom Billington, the Dynamite Kid of the British Bulldogs. When you think of the British Bulldogs, you probably think of Davey Boy Smith and his later WWF run, and you probably aren't thinking of Tom Billington, the Dynamite Kid, the one who ended up in a wheelchair because of his diving headbutts and his flat out stiff hardcore style. He was really kind of like Benoit and Eddie Guerrero, and that didn't work out too well for either of them. He ended up one of those people whose all-out style really ended up coming back to haunt him, in the sense that he ended up in a wheelchair with numerous diseases as he got older. I think that Dynamite Kid, though, he's not in the Hall of Fame as of the making of this video, if as aware as I'm aware. I think, though, that Tom Billington, therefore, is an underrated wrestler, because though he's very respected and he's frequently mentioned and known, he's not completely underrated, but I think he's underrated for the fact that he's one of the, if not the best in-the-ring wrestler of all time. And I think that people hesitate to mention because of some of the domestic violence accusations, or roid rage accusations, or he has a mental illness accusations or whatever. I think that there should be some barrier, and this is controversial opinion probably, between what somebody does off screen and what they do on screen, so we can still look at the professional wrestlers of history, people like Chris Benoit, who maybe have done things that were reprehensible off screen. Do we have to whitewash their legacies from history, though, and not enjoy any of the matches they were in? I don't know. I'm not saying I want to throw a party in his honor and the anniversary of that whole thing. I'm just saying that it really makes it so. I think that we should pay more attention to people who maybe, kind of like the Ultimate Warrior's political views were controversial, to say the least, and he was kind of ignored for the same reason that Hulk Hogan's old comments that he made that were racial came back to haunt him. Okay, I acknowledge both of those comments made those guys look like jackasses. I'm just saying, though, that do we have to not acknowledge that they're some of the best wrestlers of all time? It doesn't really mean that you're condoning anything they said to think that they're some of the best of all time. I think that's kind of how it works for Tom Billington, though he ended up in a state that is unenviable for any wrestler, to say the least. What he did in the ring, what he gave of himself and his matches, especially versus like Tiger Mask or something, so many to choose. I think that Tom Billington is therefore still an underrated wrestler, though he's widely acknowledged and respected, because he's left out of the Hall of Fame. He's the second oft most remembered member of his own most famous incarnation of his tag team with Davey Boy Smith. Most people think of the British Bulldog instead of the Dynamite Kid. I mean, not that the Dynamite Kid isn't remembered. I'm just saying that I feel he's underrated because of some of the acrimony after his retirement and the unenviable position he was in makes wrestling look in a bad light, which is probably WWE's ignoring his legacy for PR reasons, thus, which is doesn't really shine well on them, in my opinion, of them morally, at least. Not that that really makes much of a difference, but you know how I feel. Um, Number 4 on here. This is probably going to end up being a two-part video. Number 4 on here is going to be Homicide. I mostly know him from TNA or ROH. I don't think he ever wrestled in WWE. Did he? I don't think in any capacity I ever saw whatsoever. But I think that he had the ability to go and play up the angle of, like Latino pride, like as a face, kind of the same way Eddie Guerrero did, or Rey Mysterio did. You know, cultural pride and carry the flag in the kind of 80s face sense. Um, I think that Homicide did that well, but he was also a great heel. And he was brutal in the ring in hardcore matches. He was willing to go very far with the violence, with the blood, with the gore, with anything that I mean. All you have to do is look at some of the matches put out on ROH's DVDs, which are classic, by the way. Um, and they often feature Homicide as one of the main selling matches, kind of like they featured Samoa Joe versus Kenta Kobashi, which was obviously a dream match, classic, and it was everything that you thought it would be. But they also often featured Homicide as one of the main sellers of a match, one of the main guys on the DVD, the main event of the DVD, so to speak. But I think that Homicide is one of those guys who doesn't often get his dues as one of the best wrestlers, one of the best like 5 wrestlers of the 2000s, probably. Um, because he wasn't a WWE guy is why he's probably often ignored. He wasn't exactly in the big leagues, so to speak, during the feud between the main companies. He came in the era after those companies had folded, and it was basically TNA was a 1 gallon goldfish bowl next to the big Monterey Bay Aquarium stand, so to speak, in terms of business size. And so WWE basically had a monopoly on things. I think that's why Homicide, even though he's able to get over by, like stabbing the face repeatedly in the head with a fork, or he's able to get over, by carrying the flag. I might have mixed up if I messed up face or heel in what I said before. Sorry, I might have actually gotten those terms backwards just a minute ago. So sorry if um, I'm a little bit tired right now. Anyways, back to Homicide. I think that really he's one of the most underrated wrestlers of his generation. He was one of the few people who made me care in TNA, which is like eating healthy in McDonald's. You know, I think that Homicide was one of those people who made me care in any capacity, whether or not I was apt to the storyline before. He made me feel like I was invested in it, and I think that that's impressive. I'm a hardcore wrestling fan. I've been into this for a really long time now, and I've been a huge fan. It's been the main interest, I would say. It's been my biggest hobby of my life for a really long time. And I would say that Homicide was one of the few people, especially in my buildup of nihilistic apathy towards everything and towards wrestling often. He was one of the few people who broke through that barrier of, I feel like I've seen everything, and to make me really care again. And I think Homicide is, underrated to say the least. He's never one of those guys who got his big chance to be the guy, the John Cena or Triple H or whatever. But I think that he's one of those guys that he makes you care wherever he goes and whatever role he plays. And that's impressive to say the least. Number 5 on here, we're going back just a bit towards the mid 90s. The Eliminators. Kronus is number 5 on this list. I think that Kronus, though he often gets his dues as somebody who died too soon in wrestling, due to drugs or due to alcoholism, he's one of those people who Though he gets some dues as having great athleticism for his size, doesn't often get mentioned as one of the greatest tag team wrestlers of all time. When you hear names like the Rockers, when you hear names like the Hardy Boys, Edge and Christian, the Dudleys, when you hear names like the Hart Foundation and the Freebirds, and when you hear names like when you hear names like the Four Horsemen, I'm bringing up some factions here too. But you don't always hear the Eliminators and the teams in ECW who really held that division up with their blood, sweat, and tears. Especially a guy like Cronus, who was willing to go to crazy length in his bumps and in his spots. I think that a guy like Cronus, therefore, deserves a lot more recognition in the ring. We're going to go to part 2 now. Thank you for watching. I love you guys. I'm out.